In the spring of 1943, the European sky trembled under the deep, rhythmic hum of radial engines. At dawn, on the airfields of eastern England, long rows of silver bombers stood waiting, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, heavy and cold, their fuselages glinting in the mist. Ground crews moved like clockwork among them, fueling, loading bombs, checking turrets and oxygen lines. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and frozen grass. When the signal came, one by one, the engines started, coughing into life until the entire base vibrated. Soon after, the first aircraft rolled down the runway, heavy with fuel and ordnance, lifting slowly into a sky that promised both duty and danger. From a distance, the departing bombers looked like migrating flocks, each moving in perfect sequence. In the cockpits, men in fleece-lined jackets checked their altimeters and formation lights, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The order of the day was radio silence. Every unnecessary transmission risked giving away the group's position to German listening stations scattered along the Channel coast. The Luftwaffe's Funkaufklärung units had learned to triangulate even brief bursts of chatter. In response, the 8th Air Force demanded discipline, no words unless vital, no talk that could betray them. The silence in the cabins was not the silence of peace. It was tense and deliberate. Engines droned so loudly that even if a man shouted, his words would be swallowed by the vibration. The intercom carried only the clipped voice of the pilot giving altitude or heading. The rest was left to instinct. Each crew member trusted the others as if they were extensions of the same body. The navigator tracked the course by stars and maps pinned to the table, the bombardier checked the northern sight for later, and the gunner scanned the horizon, watching for the small, dark specks that could turn into Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. As the bombers climbed through the overcast sky, condensation trails formed long white ribbons, merging into one vast pattern that stretched for miles. Below them, the English countryside disappeared beneath a layer of cloud, while ahead, the expanse of the North Sea glinted in pale light. Soon the formation would cross into hostile airspace, where every signal, every spark in the ether, might mean interception. From the ground, observers often said the formations looked impossibly steady, as if each aircraft were tied to invisible threads. In truth, maintaining that precision demanded relentless focus. The pilots flew within a few dozen feet of one another, aligning wingtips and tail sections through turbulence and flak bursts. There was no room for hesitation. When one banked, the others followed, trusting not words but movement. It was formation flying elevated to an art form, born from necessity and perfected through repetition. For the men inside, the formation felt like both a shield and a cage. They knew that only together could they survive the Luftwaffe's attacks, yet one mistake from a single pilot could destroy several planes at once. They flew not as individuals but as a single organism, moving with mechanical precision through air filled with danger. Somewhere ahead lay their targets, industrial plants, rail yards, refineries deep in Germany, but in those early hours, their battle was not yet against the enemy. It was against fear, against the urge to break silence, against the chaos that could erupt if discipline failed. By the time the formation reached altitude, the English coast had faded behind them, replaced by the endless blue-gray of the Channel. Radios stayed quiet. Every man understood the rules. Silence was survival. What guided them now was not communication but trust, the quiet knowledge that the machine beside them, above them, and below them would hold its place. And in that fragile order, amid the roar of engines and the weight of anticipation, the air war over Europe truly began. At the beginning of America's air war over Europe, the radio was both a lifeline and a liability. In 1942, when the first U.S. bomber groups arrived in England, crews used their transmitters freely during training and early missions. They called out headings, checked altitudes, and confirmed formations over open frequencies, unaware that every word carried beyond friendly skies. Across the Channel, German listening stations, Funkaufklärung units of the Luftwaffe, were already mapping the electromagnetic noise that filled the air. By triangulating these transmissions, German operators could trace the origin and direction of American bomber streams long before they appeared on radar or were sighted visually. Even a few seconds of undisciplined chatter could reveal the composition and altitude of a formation, allowing fighter units to climb into position ahead of time. The British had warned their new allies about this danger. They had experienced it themselves during the Blitz, when careless radio use had guided enemy aircraft toward convoys and airfields. The Germans had developed sophisticated signal detection networks along the European coast, stretching from Norway to France, known collectively as the Y Service. These stations could intercept Allied traffic, plot its bearing, and relay information to Luftwaffe command centers in real time. The moment a formation of flying fortresses crossed the North Sea, the German Signal Corps could begin assembling an intercept picture, even if no radar contact had yet been made. The 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe quickly realized that the advantage of real-time coordination was outweighed by the price of exposure. Orders were issued to all bomber groups: minimize transmission, maintain radio silence except for emergencies, and rely on prearranged signals whenever possible. Commanders called it emission control, a doctrine designed to mask the approach of massive raids. For the men who flew the missions, this meant that every routine exchange, requesting course confirmation, asking for a position check, reporting minor damage, had to be suppressed. The air became a paradox, filled with the thunder of engines yet silent of human voices. Inside the formations, the absence of radio communication created a new kind of dependence. Crews had to rely entirely on visual cues from their lead aircraft. A single flare color or wing rock replaced entire sentences. The leader's position lights became the heartbeat of the formation, signaling turns, climbs, and bomb runs. For inexperienced pilots, especially replacements who had never flown in combat before, this demanded an almost unnatural level of concentration. Every movement of the leading aircraft had to be mirrored precisely. Hesitation could break alignment, while overcorrection risked collision. The problem extended beyond navigation. In combat, when Luftwaffe fighters attacked from above and behind, the instinct to warn others or call for help had to be resisted. Radio silence was to be maintained even under fire, except for emergencies such as the command, Mayday, or a distress signal from the group leader. The defensive power of the formation depended on its cohesion, and cohesion depended on trust. A crew that broke formation to evade an attack or a pilot who shouted into the ether could endanger everyone around them. The technical side of the problem also reflected the limitations of the time. Bomber radios, usually SCR-274N or command sets integrated with intercom systems, were reliable but not encrypted. Voice transmissions could be picked up by German ground stations and translated, since American crews often spoke in clear English without coded brevity terms. The use of frequency hopping or secure voice systems was still years away. Even when messages were transmitted in code, the act of transmission itself, its direction, power, and timing, was enough to betray a unit's position. This vulnerability forced the 8th Air Force to build a new culture of discipline. Pilots and navigators trained to communicate without speaking, learning the language of movement, the slight bank of a wing to signal a turn, the steady climb that indicated a change in altitude, the precise timing of throttle adjustments to keep spacing exact. What had once been an exercise in radio coordination became a ballet of precision flying. The greatest danger of this silence was psychological. Crews accustomed to constant chatter now faced long hours of isolation, knowing that only the steady rhythm of engines connected them to the rest of the group. They could not ask for reassurance, or verify their course except through sight. The burden of command shifted heavily onto the lead pilot, whose every decision guided dozens of bombers and hundreds of lives. A single error, an early turn, a mistimed climb, could scatter the formation across enemy territory and destroy the mission plan. In the end, the problem of radio discipline was not just technical but human. It required airmen to suppress instinct, to trust procedure over conversation, and to replace the comfort of communication with the precision of silence. In the vast air over Europe, survival depended on order that could not be heard. In the years before the United States entered the Second World War, the idea of precision bombing occupied the minds of American air strategists. The U.S. Army Air Corps, still a branch of the Army rather than an independent service, believed that future wars would be won not by trenches or naval blockades but by air power applied directly to the enemy's industrial heart. This doctrine, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in Maxwell Field, Alabama, held that a fleet of heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formations, could strike factories, rail junctions, and oil refineries with surgical accuracy. The bombers would be fast enough, strong enough, and numerous enough to defend themselves without the need for escort fighters. It was a bold and largely untested theory, one that would soon define the air war over Europe. The origins of formation tactics went back to the 1930s, when officers such as Harold George Haywood Hansell and Lawrence Kuter, influenced by the writings of General Billy Mitchell, began experimenting with group flying during large-scale maneuvers. Early bomber models like the B-10 and B-18 lacked the defensive range or altitude to survive modern interception, but they offered valuable insight into how mutual protection could be achieved through geometry rather than speed. The central idea was simple: several bombers, if arranged properly, could cover each other's blind spots with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. A formation of many aircraft, therefore, could become a fortress in the sky, a mobile fortress built from men and metal rather than stone. By 1940, the first prototype of the B-17 Flying Fortress was already demonstrating this theory in peacetime exercises. The Air Corps tested formations that mirrored the V patterns used by geese in migration, adjusting spacing and elevation to balance visibility and defensive coverage. Pilots learned to fly in 3 ship elements, each a miniature wedge, stacked diagonally above and behind the others. 3 such elements made up a squadron, and 3 squadrons formed a bomb group. This 3-tiered organization produced a pattern that would later be known as the combat box. It allowed gunners in the upper and lower positions of one bomber to protect its neighbors, creating interlocking arcs of fire. The theory matured through large-scale exercises conducted in places like Colorado, California, and Texas, where crews practiced flying in formation for hours at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. These drills revealed the mental and physical strain required to hold a steady position in turbulent air, often within a few dozen feet of another aircraft. Instructors emphasized that formation discipline was as important as marksmanship or navigation. A drifting wingman could leave a gap for an attacking fighter or cause a mid-air collision. The pilots were taught to trust the movement of the group, to think not as individuals but as parts of a single formation. Technological developments supported this new doctrine. The introduction of the Norden bombsight, a gyroscopic device promising unprecedented accuracy, reinforced the belief that bombers could destroy point targets from high altitude without needing fighter escort. Combined with self-sealing fuel tanks, multiple gun turrets, and improved armor, the B-17 and later the B-24 embodied the philosophy of self-contained air power. To the planners at the Air Corps Tactical School, the combination of precision instruments and disciplined formations promised a revolution in warfare: strategic bombing conducted by daylight, striking deep within enemy territory. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, this doctrine was put to the test. The newly established 8th Air Force, deployed to England in 1942, brought with it both the machines and the mindset of the pre-war theorists. The officers who had once debated tactics in classrooms at Maxwell Field were now leading real combat wings across the Atlantic. They carried with them the conviction that tight formations, armed with coordinated fields of fire and guided by the Norden sight, could achieve victory through precision rather than saturation. Early missions over occupied France and the Low Countries revealed both the strengths and the limits of these pre-war ideas. The formations provided strong defensive firepower, but maintaining their cohesion in combat proved far more difficult than in training. Turbulence, anti-aircraft fire, and casualties could quickly disrupt the perfect geometry envisioned by instructors. Yet the underlying structure, the 3-plane element, the squadron box, and the group echelon, remained the backbone of American bombing tactics throughout the war. By 1942, the concept had evolved into a complete system. Each squadron was assigned its position relative to the others. Visual signals replaced much of the radio coordination, and every man, from the pilot to the tail gunner, understood the logic of the box. These formations, refined in the wide skies of the American Southwest, would soon fly over the clouds of Europe, where theory would meet reality under the fire of the Luftwaffe. The combat box, once a diagram on a blackboard, became the living shape of the American Air War, a structure built from discipline, geometry, and faith in the machine. The turning point for the doctrine of formation flying came in the summer of 1943, when the United States Army Air Forces launched their most ambitious daylight bombing operations to date, the twin raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. These missions, known collectively as the Schweinfurt Regensburg operation, were designed to test the limits of American precision bombing, both technically and psychologically. For the first time, large groups of B-17 flying fortresses would penetrate deep into Germany without continuous fighter escort, striking two vital targets hundreds of miles apart. It was a bold demonstration of faith in the combat box formation, the Norden bombsight, and the belief that disciplined flying could overcome the absence of radio communication and fighter protection. On August 17, 1943, more than 370 bombers lifted off from airfields across eastern England. Their objective was twofold. One division would bomb the Messerschmitt aircraft factories in Regensburg, while another would target the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, whose output was crucial to German industry. The plan called for the formations to depart hours apart, striking their respective targets in succession to divide German defenses. The Regensburg group, after bombing, was to continue southward to bases in North Africa rather than return to England, making the mission a one-way flight. Every aspect of the operation depended on precise coordination, timing, altitude, and course, without the benefit of constant radio updates. The Luftwaffe quickly detected the approaching formations through its radar and signal networks, but the American bombers maintained radio silence as ordered. Only prearranged signals, colored flares, wing dips, or light blinks from the lead ship were used to transmit instructions. In the air, this created a strange duality: immense, organized power coupled with complete verbal restraint. Each pilot focused on the position of the leader, aligning his bomber within a few dozen feet of its assigned slot. Gunners scanned the skies while navigators checked drift and wind correction by sight and instrument. The formations moved like airborne machines, their unity enforced not by words but by training and trust. As the bombers crossed into Germany, waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rose to intercept them. The first attacks came over Belgium, followed by relentless engagements lasting more than 2 hours. Without fighter escort, the P-47 Thunderbolts could not yet reach that far. The bombers relied entirely on their defensive geometry. Each combat box became a revolving fortress, its gunners firing in coordinated arcs that protected the group's vulnerable flanks. In the midst of chaos, the discipline of silence held. Crews communicated through hand signals, light flashes, and instinct. The leader's movements dictated every turn and altitude change. Over Regensburg, the 1st Division released its bombs with remarkable precision, hitting the Messerschmitt assembly lines and causing significant damage to the factory complex. But the success came at a terrible cost. Many bombers, now low on fuel and under continuous attack, continued south to North Africa, leaving behind the second wave heading for Schweinfurt. There, German defenses were fully alerted. Heavy flak blanketed the sky, and fighters attacked from all directions. Still, the formations pressed on, maintaining cohesion despite catastrophic losses. Out of 376 bombers dispatched that morning, 60 were destroyed in combat, and more than 100 returned damaged. Nearly 600 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. The Schweinfurt Regensburg raid exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of the American strategy. The formation discipline worked. The groups reached their targets and inflicted serious industrial damage, but the absence of long-range escort made the missions nearly suicidal. Yet even amid destruction, something remarkable occurred: the formations rarely disintegrated. Crews clung to their leaders until the end, dropping bombs as planned and withdrawing in organized groups rather than scattering. The ability to maintain formation under such conditions proved that the training and the visual coordination methods, colored flares, light guns, and mechanical precision, were effective even when radio silence was absolute. In the aftermath, Air Force commanders analyzed every aspect of the operation. They concluded that the combat box system had fulfilled its purpose, allowing bombers to reach and strike distant targets without chaos. But they also recognized that no amount of discipline could substitute for proper fighter cover. Still, the raid became a defining moment. It showed that tight formation flying, supported by visual communication and unwavering training, could hold the line against overwhelming odds. The men who returned from Schweinfurt and Regensburg carried proof that silence, precision, and unity could sustain order even in the heart of enemy territory. Historically, the Regensburg, Schweinfurt raids marked the first large-scale attempt by the 8th Air Force to implement deep penetration bombing without radio coordination or escort protection. The cost forced a reevaluation of strategy and accelerated the development of the long-range P-51 Mustang. But the mission also cemented the legend of the Flying Fortress and the resilience of its crews. In those hours of combat, the principles of formation flying, discipline, geometry, and trust were no longer theories tested in training fields. They became the means of survival in the most hostile skies on Earth. The formation had been engineered as much as it had been taught. Designers and tacticians had worked together to turn a mass of individual aircraft into a single defensive system, and every element, spacing, altitude, turret placement, and timing, served that system. The basic combat box placed aircraft in staggered, echelon positions so that the arcs of fire from their machine gun turrets overlapped. A fighter attempting to attack one bomber would enter the firing cone of several others. Waist guns, top turrets, the ball turret under the belly, and the tail position were arranged so that blind spots were minimized when neighboring ships held their stations. This was not luck but deliberate geometry. The Flying Fortress and the Liberator had multiple manned gun positions by design, and formations exploited those positions to create mutual protection that far exceeded the defensive capability of any single airplane. On the technical side, the bomber that led the element carried the burden of precision. The lead bombardier used the Norden bomb sight, a stabilized, gyroscopic instrument that translated ground position and aircraft attitude into a computed release point. The Norden could be coupled to the aircraft's automatic pilot to hold the plane steady on the bomb run with far greater consistency than manual control alone. By locking the autopilot to the bomb sight output, the lead ship presented a steadier, more predictable target for the rest of the group and maximized the chance that the computed impact point matched the intended aiming point. The mission profile moved from navigation to attack with deliberate choreography. Crews navigated toward an initial point, a clearly defined visual landmark, or radial fix, and from that point the formation began its final bomb run. The lead bombardier established the approach, corrected for wind drift, and, at the computed moment, released. Other aircraft did not attempt independent precision bombing. Doctrine prescribed that the rest of the formation timed their releases to the leader, a practice commonly called drop on leader, or formation bombing. Pilots and bombardiers watched the lead ship's position lights, the visual alignment of fuselages, and sometimes smoke or flare markers to synchronize the moment of release. The steadiness provided by the Norden-coupled autopilot and the predictable flight path of the lead airplane allowed dozens of bomb bays to open within seconds of one another, producing a concentrated pattern of ordnance over the target. Maintaining that precision required exact spacing. Crews held positions at measured lateral and vertical separations, compensating constantly for wake, turbulence, and evasive action. Instrumentation aided the process. Formation lights, simple position lamps, and wingtip markers helped pilots keep visual references in poor visibility or against a bright sky. Intercoms connected crews within a single aircraft, but interplane voice communication was minimized. Instead, formations relied on pre-brief timing, visual cues, and the steady hand of the lead bombardier to convert planning into effect. Defensive considerations also shaped engineering choices. Fuel and weight distributions, turret fields of fire, and structural reinforcements were balanced so that damaged but still airborne aircraft could limp in formation rather than immediately fall out and create gaps. Flight engineers and crewmen trimmed control surfaces, managed engine power and feathering, and monitored hydraulic and electrical systems with the aim of preserving position integrity. Even damage control was practiced with formation continuity in mind. In sum, the process combined aeronautical design, precision instruments, and drilled human procedure. The combat box turned the many into one, an array of turrets that overlapped fields of fire, a lead ship whose Northern sight and autopilot made a steady bombing platform, and crews whose timing and visual discipline synchronized dozens of bomb releases into a single, deliberate strike. The result was not perfect accuracy by later standards, but for its time it was an integrated system that translated training and engineering into concentrated effects over heavily defended targets. The test of theory came not in classrooms or training ranges, but in the skies above Germany. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg raids of August 1943 marked the moment when every assumption behind formation bombing met the reality of war. The men who flew those missions had spent months memorizing diagrams, practicing formation drills, and perfecting bomb runs in calm skies over England. But over Bavaria, the air turned black with flak and swarming fighters, and what had been a matter of geometry became a fight for survival. As the first divisions crossed into enemy territory, radar-directed anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from the ground, filling the sky with black bursts at altitudes approaching 25,000 feet. Shrapnel tore through fuselages, punctured oxygen lines, and shredded control cables. Engines failed, wings twisted, yet the bombers maintained their positions with an almost mechanical precision. Crews fought to stay in formation even as their instruments failed and control columns vibrated under the strain. The discipline drilled into them at bases in Texas and Colorado now became their only defense. The geometry of the combat box, once an abstract pattern on a chalkboard, held together under fire because the men inside it refused to let it break. Fighter attacks came in waves, Bf-109s and Fw-190s diving through the formations from the front and above, firing their 20mm cannons before breaking off and circling back for another pass. Individual bombers could not outmaneuver them, so survival depended on the collective defense. Each gunner knew his sector of fire. Waist gunners tracked attackers crossing behind, while the top turret covered the arcs above. The interlocking fields of fire created a curtain of tracers that forced many fighters to attack from distance, reducing their accuracy. Crews could see neighboring aircraft burning, spinning away, yet the survivors kept their spacing, holding formation to maintain the group's protective geometry. Over Schweinfurt, the sky was thick with smoke and fragments of aluminum. The lead bombardiers guided their formations through the initial point toward the target area, where the city's ball-bearing plants gleamed through the haze. At that stage, every aircraft in the group aligned with the lead ship's steady path. The bomb bay doors opened in unison, the Norden bombsight on the lead bomber computed the release, and within seconds, dozens of aircraft dropped their loads in near-perfect synchronization. To the crews watching from neighboring planes, the sequence looked almost unreal. Columns of falling bombs separating and converging on the ground below. Despite the precision of timing, true accuracy was far from ideal. High-altitude winds, flak bursts, and evasive movements scattered bomb patterns. Post-war analysis showed that only about 10% of the bombs landed within a 500-foot radius of their aim point. Yet, in the conditions of 1943, without radar guidance, with oxygen masks frosting over and aircraft vibrating from shell impacts, this was still considered a technical triumph. Industrial damage to the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants was severe enough to disrupt production for months, though not to cripple it permanently. The cost, however, was devastating. Of the 376 B-17s dispatched that day, 60 failed to return and more than 100 limped home riddled with holes, some landing at emergency fields across England. Nearly 600 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. Yet even in the midst of destruction, observers noted something remarkable: the formations rarely collapsed into chaos. The discipline of silence and geometry persisted to the very end. Groups that had lost half their number still managed coordinated bomb releases and organized withdrawals. For the survivors, the mission confirmed that the principles of formation flying, mutual protection, visual coordination, and trust in the lead could endure under the most extreme pressure. For commanders, it proved both the power and the limitation of the concept. The formations had succeeded in delivering their bombs and maintaining order without radios, but the cost revealed that no amount of discipline could fully compensate for the lack of long-range fighter escort. The raids became a harsh lesson that precision and courage alone could not guarantee survival. Still, in the eyes of the crews who returned, the endurance of the formation under such fire was a victory of its own kind. They had flown through the worst skies in Europe, held their lines when reason said to break, and delivered their payloads in unison, while the air itself seemed to collapse around them. The geometry had held because the men had held. And in that endurance, the theory of the combat box, flying without radios, guided by discipline and instinct, proved itself not merely a tactic, but a testament to human resolve in the machinery of modern war. By 1944, the system of combat boxes had evolved into a finely tuned structure capable of coordinating hundreds of aircraft across vast distances. What had begun as experimental formations of a few squadrons in 1942 had grown into a massive, multi-layered network of air groups and wings capable of striking targets deep inside the Reich with mechanical precision. The 8th Air Force, operating out of England, became the largest air striking force in history, launching missions involving more than 1,000 bombers at once. Each group, squadron, and element operated according to a rigid hierarchy, with positions and responsibilities mapped in detail before takeoff. The standard heavy bombardment group formation consisted of 27 aircraft organized into 3 9-plane squadrons. Each squadron maintained a staggered pattern, offset both horizontally and vertically to maximize defensive firepower while minimizing the risk of collision. When 3 groups flew together under a single wing, the total could reach 54 aircraft moving as a coordinated body. Above and behind them, other wings often joined in, filling the sky with hundreds of B-17s and B-24s arranged like layers of steel clouds. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. An aerial armada advancing at 150 miles per hour, each bomber maintaining its precise place in the pattern. The discipline required to sustain these formations over long distances was extraordinary. Crews often flew for 6 to 8 hours at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the temperature dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen systems froze, instruments malfunctioned, and yet the boxes held their shape. The pilots relied almost entirely on visual alignment, keeping formation lights and shadows in view through haze, smoke, and gunfire. Minor errors in spacing could cause catastrophic mid-air collisions, and such accidents did occur, but the overall rate of disintegration remained remarkably low given the scale of operations. As new long-range escort fighters entered service, particularly the P-51 Mustang, the role of the bomber formation began to change. With fighter cover extending deep into Germany, bombers could concentrate more on accuracy and less on mutual defense. Still, the structure of the combat box remained essential to mission success. The interlocking arcs of gunfire, though less critical with escorts overhead, continued to provide protection against flak and the occasional interception. By late 1944, American bombing formations were attacking targets in Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden with unprecedented regularity, often sending over 1,200 heavy bombers in a single coordinated raid supported by hundreds of fighters. The organizational and technical lessons of these operations extended far beyond the war itself. The concept of structured, radio-minimized formation flight became part of the post-war doctrine of the newly independent United States Air Force. The same discipline that had governed bomb runs over Schweinfurt was applied to entirely new missions: air refueling, long-range transport convoys, and aerial reconnaissance. Crews trained to fly close formations by sight and timing, preserving the principle that visual coordination and mutual trust could achieve order even in the absence of constant radio communication. Within NATO, these principles became foundational. The Cold War required the ability to move large numbers of aircraft across Europe and the North Atlantic under radio silence, in order to avoid detection by Soviet early warning systems. The training and structure developed in the 8th Air Force were directly adopted into NATO procedures for formation navigation and aerial refueling. Tanker and bomber crews practiced the same visual cues once used by World War II pilots, light signals, position alignment, and timing by the lead aircraft's movement. Even with the advent of radar and digital communication, the old rules remained a safeguard against interference and jamming. The scale of American bomber operations also transformed the way air warfare was understood. Before 1943, strategic bombing had been an unproven theory. By 1945, it was an industrial process involving hundreds of thousands of personnel, thousands of aircraft, and complex logistical networks that spanned continents. The coordination achieved without constant radio chatter proved that disciplined planning and visual synchronization could command entire fleets in the most hostile environments. When the war ended, the legacy of these formations lived on in both technology and training philosophy. Pilots who had flown in the combat boxes went on to instruct the next generation of aviators, emphasizing precision flying, formation discipline, and mutual dependence. The lessons of Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin, where silence and geometry had guided men through chaos, became the blueprint for modern air power. The sky itself had become a vast, structured machine, built not just from engines and wings, but from the enduring idea that order and trust could prevail even where communication failed. The legacy of formation flying and silent coordination extended far beyond the battlefields of the Second World War. When the war ended in 1945, thousands of airmen returned home carrying not only the memories of combat but also a new understanding of discipline, teamwork, and precision. The lessons they had learned in the skies over Europe and the Pacific became the foundation of modern air doctrine. What began as an improvised solution to the dangers of radio interception evolved into a philosophy of flying that shaped generations of military and civilian pilots alike. In the immediate post-war years, the newly formed United States Air Force institutionalized these wartime practices. Training manuals emphasize formation discipline, spatial awareness, and the ability to maintain relative position without dependence on radio communication. The films shot by the Army Air Forces during the war, documentaries showing B-17s and B-24s moving in near-perfect symmetry, became standard instructional material. Cadets studied these black and white reels frame by frame, learning to interpret the subtle cues of wing alignment and throttle control. The idea was not nostalgia, it was practicality. If radar and communications were ever disrupted in combat, a pilot's ability to fly by sight and instinct could still mean survival. Formation principles found renewed relevance during the Cold War. In the 1950s and 1960s, Strategic Air Command adopted the same logic of silence and coordination that had guided the 8th Air Force. Nuclear-armed bombers like the B-47 Stratojet and B-52 Stratofortress often trained under strict radio silence to prevent detection by Soviet early warning systems. Pilots practiced visual rendezvous, timing to the second, and air-to-air refueling procedures that demanded the same level of precision once required in wartime bombing runs. In an age of jet propulsion and atomic weapons, the lessons of the propeller era still governed the behavior of crews thousands of feet above the earth. Outside of strategic bombing, the influence of those wartime formations spread across every branch of aviation. Airlift squadrons flying C-47s, C-54s, and later C-130s used similar methods to move troops and supplies in synchronized columns. Tactical jet formations borrowed many of the same visual principles: spacing, echelon structure, and reliance on the leader's movement rather than constant radio direction. Even in aerobatic teams like the Thunderbirds and Blue Angels, the roots of precision formation flight could be traced directly to the B-17 boxes over Europe. The heritage of flying as one body became both a tactical necessity and a symbol of mastery. Technological progress made communication easier, but the underlying philosophy remained unchanged. Radios grew clearer, radar improved, and digital data links appeared, yet instructors continued to teach that no system could replace situational awareness and mutual trust. Pilots were expected to feel the rhythm of their formation, to anticipate rather than react, to interpret minute shifts in wing position or exhaust trails. The best formations were still those that looked effortless, where communication was invisible because every participant understood the collective rhythm. The archival footage of wartime missions survived as both historical evidence and teaching tool. At flight schools and museums, instructors showed cadets how massive bomber groups had once crossed continents with minimal electronic coordination. The image of hundreds of flying fortresses moving together through flak and fire became a lesson in professionalism rather than nostalgia. It demonstrated that order could be created from silence, and that technology was only as effective as the discipline of the people using it. By the late 20th century, these lessons had become part of the shared culture of aviation. The emphasis on mutual awareness extended into civilian aviation, from airline cockpit coordination to formation flying in airshows. The standard phrase, "see and avoid," echoed the wartime creed of vigilance and spatial awareness. Even as automation and computer systems assumed more control, the principle survived. Every pilot remained responsible not only for his own aircraft but for the harmony of the group around him. In this way, the spirit of the wartime formations endured, not as a relic of a bygone conflict, but as a living language of flight. The silence that once protected bombers over Germany became a metaphor for professionalism itself, precision born from trust, order maintained through discipline, and unity achieved without words. For every generation of aviators who studied those old training films, the message remained clear. Machines could evolve, radios could improve, but the foundation of safe and effective flight would always rest on the same human qualities that had guided the flying fortresses through the storm: awareness, restraint, and faith in one another. The story of the American pilots who flew in near silence was ultimately a story about the boundaries of human coordination and the invisible threads that connect individuals under pressure. In an age when machines grew louder and war became increasingly mechanized, their discipline represented a paradox: order through quiet, unity through isolation. They had flown into battle surrounded by the roar of engines yet bound by a rule that forbade them from speaking. In that silence they discovered something rare: the ability of people to move, act, and survive as one mind without the need for constant instruction. The radio silence that governed their missions was more than a tactical necessity. It was a philosophy that revealed how trust could replace technology when technology became a liability. Each man in the formation surrendered a part of his individuality for the sake of the whole. The pilot at the controls depended on the steadiness of the leader ahead, the gunners trusted unseen neighbors to protect their blind spots, and the bombardier released his payload in rhythm with strangers flying dozens of meters away. It was cooperation at its purest form, forged not in conversation but in repetition, training, and faith. This collective discipline mirrored a deeper truth about war in the 20th century. Technology had promised control, precision, and communication, yet it often introduced new vulnerabilities. Signals could be intercepted, machines could fail, and systems could betray their users. The men who flew without speaking showed that human instinct, shaped by discipline and mutual understanding, could still surpass the limitations of their instruments. Their success did not depend on innovation alone but on the synchronization of willpower and purpose. In an environment where chaos reigned, silence became their armor. There was also a moral dimension to their silence. It stripped away the illusion that war could be managed like a machine. Every man in the formation carried the weight of others. Every decision to hold course or to deviate meant life or death for those nearby. The absence of words forced responsibility inward. It was not a commander's voice that kept the formation intact but the quiet resolve of each pilot who refused to drift away. In that restraint, the line between obedience and empathy blurred. Discipline was not just about following orders but about protecting others through consistency and precision. For those who survived the war, the memory of that silence stayed with them long after the engine stopped. They remembered the way light reflected off neighboring wings, the subtle movement of another aircraft signaling a turn, the unspoken rhythm that held them together through smoke and shrapnel. It was a form of communication that transcended speech, a language built from habit, trust, and shared risk. Many veterans later described that unity as something spiritual, an experience of being part of a living structure greater than themselves. In historical hindsight, their story revealed the tension that defined modern warfare, between technology and humanity, between control and vulnerability. The radio silence of the bomber crews became a metaphor for the limits of progress. No matter how advanced the instruments, the ultimate success of any system still depended on human judgment, endurance, and cooperation. The formations over Europe proved that the heart of coordination was not in the signal but in the people who maintained it through understanding and discipline. Thus, the quiet sky of 1943 was not empty but full of meaning. Beneath the thunder of engines lay a deeper stillness, the stillness of minds aligned toward a single purpose. It was a harmony that no machine could replicate, and no algorithm could design. The silence that once protected them from enemy detection became the lasting symbol of their professionalism and moral clarity. In that soundless order, forged in fear and trust, humanity reasserted itself within the machinery of war. It was the moment when 1,000 isolated men ceased to be separate individuals and became a single, breathing organism, an army that moved not by command, but by shared conviction.